It was supposed to be the trial of the century, a chance for Colombia's most powerful man to finally clear his name. But what began as Álvaro Uribe's fight to prove his innocence ended last week in a stunning verdict that no one saw coming. For the first time in Colombian history, a former president was sentenced to prison, and he's not alone. In the last 20 years, Latin America's most influential leaders have been falling like dominoes, brought down by corruption, betrayal, and dark secrets finally dragged into the light. Stick around, because today we're diving deep into the scandals, trials, and explosive convictions of Latin America's most powerful ex-presidents. Crack open Latin America's boldest secrets. Fact-checked, footnoted, and irresistible. I'm Arturo, and this is LatinLora. From Latin America's history, to mysteries and true crime, to local legends, whispering Latin intrigue, every tale is triple verified in archives before it reaches your headphones. Hit subscribe, fresh revelations drop every week, ready for your next campfire debate. Colombia, Álvaro Uribe's spectacular fall. Álvaro Uribe wasn't just any politician, he shaped modern Colombia. The tough, charismatic 73-year-old, once called the most powerful man in the country, never imagined his downfall would be by his own hand. Back in 2012, Uribe boldly accused Senator Iván Cepeda of manipulating witnesses to falsely link him to violent paramilitary groups. But this bold gamble dramatically backfired. Instead of clearing Uribe's name, the Supreme Court turned the tables and accused the ex-president himself of bribing witnesses and obstructing justice. After 13 tense years, 67 hearings, and the eyes of a nation glued to the courtroom drama, Judge Sandra Heredia delivered the verdict last week. While she cleared Uribe of simple bribery charges, she sentenced him to 12 years of house arrest for witness tampering and procedural fraud. On top of confinement, Uribe must pay an astonishing fine of over $800,000 and is banned from public office for almost a decade. A shocking end for a man who once seemed untouchable. But Uribe's conviction is far from unique. It's part of a larger pattern. Across Latin America, the mighty have fallen, and justice has come knocking at the doors of once untouchable figures. Peru, a legacy of presidential scandal. Few nations match Peru's dramatic presidential downfall saga. It begins with Alberto Fujimori, who ruled with an iron fist from 1990 to 2000, later fleeing justice as human rights violations piled up. Captured in Chile and extradited back home, Fujimori faced justice in a landmark trial, becoming the first democratically elected leader sentenced in his own country for grave human rights abuses. The court handed down 25 years for crimes committed by the notorious Colina death squad, including mass murders and kidnappings. Fujimori died shortly after a controversial humanitarian pardon in 2024, leaving behind a legacy stained by brutality. His successors hardly fared better. Alejandro Toledo, once hailed as a beacon of democratic hope, now sits behind bars, sentenced to over 20 years for taking bribes from the Brazilian giant Odebrecht. Next in line, Ollanta Humala received a 15-year sentence for campaign finance corruption, while Pedro Pablo Kuczynski remains under house arrest, staring down a potential 35-year sentence for money laundering. Martin Vizcarra is currently on trial, accused of taking multi-million-dollar bribes during his governorship. And most recently, Pedro Castillo, who tried and spectacularly failed to dissolve Congress and impose emergency rule in 2022, is awaiting trial on rebellion charges, facing over 3 decades in prison. Peru, it seems, is cursed with presidents who rise spectacularly only to crash even harder. Panama, the elusive Ricardo Martinelli. In Panama, Ricardo Martinelli's political journey reads like a gripping thriller. President from 2009 to 2014, Martinelli fled to the U.S. only to be dragged back to Panama to face accusations of illegally wiretapping political rivals, a case known as the Escuchas scandal. Although initially acquitted, the trial was reopened, culminating in a tense second trial. Martinelli was finally convicted in 2023, sentenced to over 10 years behind bars. Yet Martinelli had one last trick up his sleeve. He sought refuge at Nicaragua's embassy, leading to a diplomatic standoff. Ultimately, he evaded capture by slipping quietly into Colombia in 2025, granted asylum and leaving Panama's justice system empty-handed. It's a twisted end to an ongoing drama that feels more like a spy thriller than political history. Argentina's presidential downfall, Menem and Kirchner. Carlos Menem, Argentina's controversial president in the 90s, faced numerous trials for corruption. Convicted in 2015 for diverting millions of secret intelligence funds, Menem managed to escape prison until his death in 2021, a conviction never fully ratified. But Cristina Fernández de Kirchner's story is still unfolding. Once one of Argentina's most powerful leaders, Cristina now faces 6 years of house arrest after a Supreme Court decision confirmed her guilt in a massive infrastructure corruption scandal. Once untouchable, her future is now sealed, permanent political exile behind her own doors. Brazil, Lula, and Collor's battles with corruption. Brazil, too, has a storied past with presidential scandal. Fernando Collor de Mello, impeached decades ago, resurfaced in headlines with an 8-year prison sentence for corruption, now serving his time under house arrest. And Lula da Silva, Brazil's charismatic and beloved two-time president, famously spent time behind bars, only to return triumphantly to office in 2023. Although cleared on appeal, Lula still battles ongoing corruption accusations that threaten his hard-won legacy. Ecuador's Correa and Mahuad, from presidency to exile. Jamil Mahuad, whose disastrous economic policies sparked Ecuador's devastating financial crisis in 1999, lives quietly in the U.S., sentenced in absentia to 8 years for corruption. But Rafael Correa's dramatic story continues in Belgium, where he fled after being handed an 8-year sentence in 2020 for bribery. Now living as a political refugee, Correa defiantly calls his conviction politically motivated, his future uncertain, but his defiance unwavering. El Salvador, gang negotiations, and millions in bribes. Antonio Saca was El Salvador's first president jailed for corruption, sentenced to 10 years for laundering a staggering $300 million. His successor, Mauricio Funes, fared no better, sentenced in absentia to 14 years for secretly negotiating truces with violent street gangs. Funes never served his time, dying in exile in Nicaragua early this year, a bitter end to a presidency mired in betrayal. Bolivia's Jeanine Áñez, justice or political revenge? Bolivia's Jeanine Áñez found herself behind bars after a chaotic ascent following Evo Morales' controversial resignation. Sentenced to a decade in prison for alleged unconstitutional actions, her supporters claim political persecution, while opponents see justice finally served. Honduras, Juan Orlando Hernández and narco politics. Perhaps no story captures global attention quite like Juan Orlando Hernández's. Extradited to the U.S. shortly after leaving office, JOH was convicted of smuggling over 400 tons of cocaine into America, astonishingly orchestrated while serving as president. Now facing 45 years in a U.S. prison, JOH's shocking betrayal reveals how far corruption can reach and how deeply it can erode democracy itself. Guatemala's Portillo and Pérez Molina, fallen leaders. Finally, in Guatemala, Alfonso Portillo served prison time in the U.S. for laundering millions in bribes from Taiwan, while Otto Pérez Molina, another ex-president, sits in jail after admitting to running massive corruption schemes from the presidential palace itself. These stories reveal the dark heart of power in Latin America, leaders who promised change but instead delivered corruption, violence, and betrayal. Their rise and fall tell us one undeniable truth. No one, no matter how powerful, remains untouchable forever. Justice, sooner or later, always finds a way. Gracias. Thanks for trekking the hidden trails of Latin America with me. Drop your theories below, and until then, keep the legends alive and the facts on fire. I am Arturo, and this is LatinLora. If tonight's story unsettled you, subscribe and ring the bell, because Latin America's darkest stories are far from over.